good afternoon. Come on, we've got a lot of them. Please, hello. Hello. We're here to talk about nonprofits, right? One of the most exciting sectors of our community, as we just witnessed in the wake of Katrina and Rita. We saw a number of nonprofit groups who filled the gaps when our government did not do its job. So, as I said, it is one of the most exciting things we can talk about, and I'll focus our attention on how to put together a nonprofit in the New York metropolitan area, but we'll also talk about some of the larger philosophical issues. I'd like to thank President Waldron and Dean Bertzel and Jack Roskoff for allowing me to spend this time with you today. I also want to make sure everybody has a folder, because we're going to spend some time going actually through those materials. We know that, especially with respect to religious organizations, they've been around for a long time. But most of the groups that you would consider to be a nonprofit, about 90% of those in this country, are only about 40 years old, from the 1950s forward. And we're going to talk about the current process of becoming a nonprofit, taking an idea that you may have and turning it into the reality of an organization that can then interact with the community and do good things. Because that's, after all, what a nonprofit is supposed to be doing. You're not here to make money. If you wanted to do that, you'd be in another room in this building. And we're going to also take a little time for questions and answers. For some of you, I've seen you and know that you've started your own nonprofits, and you may have some questions on how to stay on the right track. So, as we begin, how many of you have had some experience with nonprofits, either running them, working for them, thinking about them, volunteering? It's a great start. So, some of the basics in terms of terms you'll already be familiar with, but for those of you who may not, we'll spend a little time on those. Okay, in your packet you will see a checklist for starting a nonprofit. It's on this side of your folder. It says checklist. Another reason I wanted you to see it is that the source it provides, findlaw.com, is a very useful one to you. It's a free site. All the materials on FindLaw that you will need are open and available to you, and I just wanted to make sure you had a chance to see that. I will also spend a few minutes going through all of the materials in the folder so that you will know what those are. But starting with the checklist. In terms of the way FindLaw approaches this, they say it's important to know what your business name is going to be. And since you will be a corporation, that of course is very important. But before that, it's even more important to know what your mission is. What is it that you're trying to do? If you don't have a clear idea about that, then it's going to make everything else that much more difficult. If, for example, you want to do something with children, well, that's a worthy goal, but what do you want to do with children? Do you want to teach them in a daycare setting? Do you want to start a charter school? Do you want to provide support services to the public schools? Whatever answer you provide to those questions will give me a different recommendation in terms of how you would establish yourself, okay? Yet in each instance, you would be helping children. So your first important goal is to set your mission, one that is achievable and one that you can also find like-minded people to work with you on, all right? After you have your mission, again, this is even before we get to the formal legal checklist, you have to figure out who's going to help you, who's going to work with you, who will be your directors and officers, workers, volunteers, how will you reach the public? Those are some of the questions that you should think about before you even pick up your first application, okay? Especially in the current environment of greater scrutiny on corporate behavior, even non-profit corporate behavior. Some of you may have heard of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Have any of you heard of this? This is in the wake of the scandals involving WorldCom and Enron. A lot of those heightened financial rules and budgetary requirements have not yet been formally applied to nonprofits, but it's only a matter of time, and most of the major nonprofits have already started planning for it. What does that mean? It means that you cannot, it's not sufficient to write your budget out on an envelope. Okay? You must have a formal budget that a certified public accountant prepares, not someone in the family who's good at math. Okay? Those are some of the changes that you will see as, regardless of your size, your internal mechanism has to be routinized. You have to spend the time up front setting and establishing good practices, and then you won't worry if the IRS knocks on your door. One of the things I tell my clients is run your operation as well as you possibly can, maintain your documents for at least 7 years, even though in some states you only have to maintain them for 3 years. And be prepared at any time for the IRS to knock on your door. If you are prepared for the IRS to knock on your door at any time, you don't have anything to worry about. Right? That means you've kept all your records in order. You will be able to say, please have a seat, can I get you a cup of coffee? Instead of running into the back room and screaming. We're going to spend a little time on what some of those basic IRS rules and regulations are. And increasingly, you also have to be aware of state laws and regulations. For example, I am president of a national organization based in Washington, D.C. that focuses on African American women and their children. And we wanted to add to our website an ability to solicit funds across the country. And in fact, since we were also serving military women around the world. And as we were putting that together, we realized that the solicitation rules were different in every single state. And if you're not aware of those rules, you might be using language or having an outreach that violates state law. And that's the last thing you want to do. And that's why we'll also talk about some of the groups that have already set up to help you with exactly that type of problem, so that you don't have to worry about violating state law. And I also, as I said, want to spend some time with you on questions that you may have. So I'm going to try to leave at least about 40, 50 minutes at the end for your questions. Anyway, back to our checklist. It's important for you to decide on a name that you're comfortable with, that's descriptive, that isn't too similar to another group, and one that you can grow into. That's another good factor. You can check to make sure it's available, that it hasn't been used by other groups, and it may be trademarked or it may be subject to copyright. You also have to spend some time deciding where to incorporate it. Is it best where you live, or would it be better where you plan on working? And especially at this tri-state, quad-state, 5-state area, you're never sure where people live. So is it important to be close to your home, or do you want to focus on your target group, at wherever that may be? How do you choose your directors? Who are those people? In general, you want them to be people who will give you good advice and say, that doesn't make very much sense, if you're doing something that doesn't make very much sense. And the more independence you're able to show, the greater your chances of surviving an audit, because it isn't just maybe two spouses and their child running a group, but it may also involve other people from the community and those who have a particular expertise in the area that you're trying to approach. Articles of incorporation. That's basically how you're describing the group that you're setting up. And there are legal requirements for that that differ by state. Your bylaws. Bylaws, for the most part, are pretty consistent across the board. But they are the way that you describe how you're going to do your business. Who's going to be involved in your board? Will it take a majority vote or 2/3 vote to pass any motion? Those types of things. And beyond that, the checklist is talking about actually applying for tax-exempt status. As a rule of thumb, it takes about 30 to 35 hours to prepare an application properly, which is why people like me get hired, because a lot of folks don't want to spend that type of time concentrating on putting together articles, bylaws, and the application itself. And then you want to think seriously about your finances. How are you going to manage the finances? The selection of your bank is very, very important. There may be times when you need a little more flexibility. You may need a loan. Is this a bank that's going to work with you? Those are some of the things any business has to be concerned about, but especially a business that's waiting for or expecting donations from other persons. Let's take another closer look at what's in your packet. In addition to the checklist, the first item was some basic information from the Internal Revenue Service. And this is telling you the rules for actually applying for an exemption. And remember, when you apply for federal tax exemption, that does not exempt you from state or local taxes. That's an entirely different process, okay? So the first packet is telling you about the federal exemption process. And if you go to the website, you will actually be able to download the forms from the site directly. We've also provided you with a compliance guide from the Internal Revenue Service. What type of records do you need to keep? What type of disclosures are required, especially for a 501c3 organization? And again, we just wanted to provide you with some of the basics in this heightened scrutiny of nonprofits. And the last publication from the IRS is this one on charitable contributions. Again, providing you with some basic information about tax-exempt entities and what type of requirements you have in running a nonprofit and acknowledging any donations that you may receive. What does the IRS expect from you? That's what's in this next document. And on the other side of your folder, we provided you with some information from a law firm that does a lot of nonprofit work. Hewitt & Associates in Boston. I'm not endorsing them, I'm just suggesting they have some very good materials on the web that are useful to you. But you can find attorneys all over the country that would be able to provide you with similar information. What I liked about the information they did provide was they focused on lobbying, which is an important topic for those of you who care about advocacy and social issues, social welfare. It's not really clear when you just read the statute what you can and cannot do. And I thought providing you with a little more information on that would be helpful. Along with that are some frequently asked questions which are contained behind the lobbying information. And finally, the area that I'll focus on next, specific information on how to incorporate in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. I didn't remember Pennsylvania, and I know some of you may be from there. So if you are, please see me afterwards, and I'll make sure we can provide that information to you. Okay, we've talked about how important the mission is, identifying what your purpose is, and how failure to plan properly may affect the success of your new nonprofit. Your business name, of course, is important. Your directors and those you entrust to be your officers will be even more important. Articles are pretty standard. Bylaws describe how you're going to operate. The application process, we provided you with some basic information on that. Licenses. Depending on the type of work you decide to do, you may need actual permits or licenses from the local or state government. Using that daycare example I gave you earlier, you might need certain types of permits to even operate a daycare. And that means taking the time to ensure that any work that you're going to do is properly licensed and insured, or even bonded in some cases. In terms of finances, that is the area that most often gets people in trouble, either because they have not properly documented cash received, or they haven't provided the type of financial information that IRS and the state government may require to make sure you're legitimate and not a front for some other type of activities, for example. So finances, I think, is one area we could spend a lot of time just talking about that, but I want to make sure we hit on a number of areas so that if you have specific questions about finances, we can get to that. And then operations. Where are you going to actually operate your nonprofit? With the proliferation of home offices these days, a lot of people start their nonprofits at home. They may not even get around to renting a formal office until 2 or 3 or even 4 years after they've first been established. So again, where do you want your headquarters to be, and who are you going to be calling upon to work for you? In the case of the Red Cross, many of you are familiar with the Red Cross. Most of its workers, if you will, are volunteers. And now there are new rules and regulations on how you can treat your volunteers. As a rule of thumb, I recommend that you treat your volunteers as if they were employees. If you do that, then you will typically avoid running into the problem of future lawsuits. And as you see from these different pieces, if you can get them all to come together in a way that makes sense for you, then I think you will be well on the way to preparing yourself for a good experience in running a nonprofit. But each of these pieces requires real attention. All right, let's take a quick look at some of the terms like 501c3, you've heard of that. Some of you may have heard of a C4 or a C7. What's a private foundation? What's a public charity? Well, typically, with respect to the 501c3, that's our most common form of nonprofit. And these are groups that are organized for charitable, religious, scientific, literary, and educational purposes. That's a pretty broad group. But you'd be surprised how many groups don't fall under, or easily fall under one of those categories. And that's why you have, if you really have some time to spend, you can go to the 501c section of the Internal Revenue Code and look at all of the different categories that are available to you beyond these 4 primary groups. But clearly, 85% of most nonprofits fall somewhere in the 501c group, and most of those are 501c3s. As I mentioned a moment ago, the exemption is from federal, not state or local taxes. What's a C4? Well, a C4 is a group that is engaged in social welfare. but it's also able to engage in more political activities. A 501c3 is not supposed to engage in any partisan political activities. That is a grounds for having your exemption removed. Whereas a C4 is allowed to participate in political activities that are connected with the group that they're involved with to improve their social welfare. Another difference between C3s and C4s is that 501c4 groups, their operations are exempt from federal taxes, but if you're a donor and you write a check to a C4, you do not get to take a tax deduction as you would with a 501c3. You see the difference? If I'm raising money under a 501c3, I make an appeal to you and I can say to you, anything you send to us is tax deductible above any basic costs, for example. But you can't say that to a donor that's giving to a C4. But another difference is any donors to a C3 have to be public. Their names are listed on your Form 990 that you file every year. Whereas donors to a C4 do not have to be listed. And that becomes another reason some people say, well, I want to support this group, but I don't know if I want my name to get on that list that goes around to every other group, because they're looking for people who are willing to write checks. If we move on, we can see that a 501c7 organization may be appropriate if your group is engaged in purely social or recreational activities. Okay? And in some instances, there are fewer requirements than you might see under C3 or C4. And better still, if you have a group that really wants to get involved in political activities, then organizing as a Section 527 committee may be the way to go. Some of you may have heard of the recent controversy following the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act over how can donors give money to political groups. And there was a lot of discussion about stopping soft money and how could politicians continue to raise money without running afoul of the new campaign finance law. Well, one of the answers to that question was the formation of so-called 527 groups that had played a major role in the 2004 election, but I think within the next probably 6 months, we're going to find that not very many people use 527s because they're going to change the rules again. It's an area under great flux. Okay, let's talk for a moment about the difference between a public charity and a private foundation. Donors to a public charity may donate up to 50% of their adjusted gross income. Well, you might ask, well, who would do that? Well, someone who's trying to place a lot of money in a foundation that they will then be involved in running, or it may be a family organization. That's one example of that. Whereas donors to a private foundation may only donate up to 30% of their adjusted gross income. The major factor that the IRS will look at is the number of supporters. Is it a small group putting up a lot of money, or are you soliciting funding from the public and your contributions are $50 or $100 a shot, that type of thing. So I think it's important that we know what the laws are, and so I'll ask you to refer to the summary sheet on incorporating in New York and obtaining a 501c3 status. We'll start with New York. That's on the top. We provided you with this information, again, to get you started and to give you an idea of how much it will cost if you want to do this. It's not cheap. And if you need it right away, then there are expedited fees. So I suggest you take your time and not spend any extra fees on what is already an expensive process. The basic processes can range from $75 for your initial filing fee, but if you need it processed immediately, it's twice that. If you're trying to obtain your 501c3 status, the initial amount could go as high as $500, but since most of you won't have over maybe $10,000 to $15,000 your first year or so, it's much less than that, about $150. And that's the Form 1023 that you would be filing for your federal tax status, and for your state certificate of incorporation, that's DOS 1511. So those are just two places to start in setting it up in New York. Now you can also file for New York income tax exemptions as well as sales tax exemptions, and that requires a process that requires you to register with the New York Attorney General. There's been a very, very outspoken proponent of holding nonprofits to the same rigorous rules that corporations generally have to face. Moving forward, looking at annual filings, there's a Form 990. Some of you have seen that. How many of you have ever seen a Form 990? Well, every nonprofit is supposed to file one on an annual basis, and it's a public document, okay? If you go into the office of any registered nonprofit, you can demand a copy of their 990. Most people don't do it. And now, with the internet, you don't have to do it because there are websites that will actually post the 990s of most major groups. And now there are even internet sites that will rate the integrity, the budgetary integrity of those organizations. For example, if you find a group that is spending, a 501c3, that's spending more than 25% of its revenues on management, that's a red flag. That's saying, wait a second, 75 cents out of a dollar should be going to whatever your mission is, your target group. And if it isn't, then it's reasonable to ask, well, what's going on? Now, that's not necessarily unreasonable when you're first starting out. Okay, you're going to have greater management expenses than once you become established, right? But if you find that you're consistently having trouble staying below that 25% threshold, then that's a good time to get some professional advice. Well, what can we do to make our bottom line look a little better? Because people they want to make sure. For example, with this Katrina disaster, not only is there the problem of scam foundations being formed, people who have no intention of sending money to Louisiana or anyplace else, but there is the problem of how is that money being managed? Some of you may have heard Oprah Winfrey announce that any money received through her website will go straight to the affected area, and that she personally would cover any administrative costs. All right? There aren't a lot of groups that can say that, because administrative costs are your costs. Those who are involved in staffing and running the organization. So it's very hard for any organization to have a 100% return to your target group. That's just not even reasonable. But if you can stay around 25% in terms of your management expenses, you will be rated very reasonably, and in fact very highly in some instances. So as a general rule, your Form 990 has to be filed 4.5 months at the end of your fiscal year. A lot of groups, especially those that do business with the government, will use the government's fiscal year, which is October 1 through September 30. Others may use a June 1st as their beginning fiscal year. Still others, and the majority, still use January 1 as the beginning of their fiscal year. So if you have a January 1 fiscal start to your year, your 990 is due by May 15th. Okay? It just gives you an idea of how much time you have to reconcile your books and prepare this very important form. In most cases, state law will accept the information that you file with the federal government on their state form. And in New York, that's Form 497. And again, this particular handout shows you filing fees that are based on the sliding scale. Now, if you're a religious organization with an overall budget of under $25,000, you don't even have to file. Okay? You're relieved of that responsibility. But make sure that if you decide not to file, that you don't take in more than $25,000. We don't want you to have a problem. Moving on to New Jersey, in case some of you are from there. The federal rules are exactly the same. But you would submit your public records filing to Trenton. Filing fee again is about $75. And you can also have expedited service. You also have the ability of obtaining a New Jersey income tax exemption. But without having a certificate of incorporation supported by an affidavit, you won't be able to do that. In New Jersey, you have both sales and use taxes, and those are subject to exemption depending on the type of organization you are. And you also have an obligation to register newly hired employees. Not volunteers, but anybody who is a full-time employee. And finally, I provided you with information about the Form CRI 200 or 300R. Those also, you can use your information from your Form 990 and fill those out. Finally, incorporating in Connecticut with the Office of the Secretary of State in Hartford. It's cheaper there, it's only $40 instead of $75. The IRS forms are exactly the same. You also have the ability to receive income tax exemption, sales use tax, and you must register with the Attorney General's office. But in Connecticut, they also provide that if you bring in less than $50,000, you have a very de minimis filing requirement. So, that's just to give you an idea of how state law works. And some general tips I try to provide to my clients: always file your required paperwork on time. If you do that, then you're not sending up a red flag. If you're late, they're going to look at it. Okay? If it's on time, they stamp it and keep moving. Another flashpoint, especially in this during this time of heightened corporate scrutiny, it's critical that you obtain insurance for your directors and officers, and it's not cheap. This type of insurance is called D&O insurance, and this is to make sure that if there is some mismanagement or mistakes made, that the board of directors has some protection. Because otherwise, if you're on the board and you engage in and your executive director may engage in wrongdoing that you're not aware of, you're still liable for any expenses that may result from that malfeasance. Let me say that again. If you're on a board and a person working for you breaks the law, you didn't know anything about it, that's not a defense. You can still be sued in your capacity as a member of the board. So it's one of the reasons I encourage every nonprofit, regardless of how small or how large, to make sure that you're protecting your board. Otherwise, you will find it extremely difficult to recruit anyone to serve on your board of directors, okay? If you can say, well, we've got D&O insurance, that'll make it a lot easier. Trust me on that one. Okay. All right, there are a number of places to go to get information. Some of that is included in your packet. A couple of places I just wanted to point out. The Foundation Center has a wealth of information on each of the topics I've raised with you so far. Groundspring.org. I like them because they're one of those groups that's trying to make it easier for you to run your nonprofit. They're who I went to solve that problem of solicitation rules in 50 different states. They have actually gone to each of the states, have worked out a relationship, and if you work through their program, you don't have to separately then go out and find out the rules for each of those state laws. There are also internet nonprofit centers that will help you pro bono, won't cost you anything. If you're concerned, you're a board member, you thought it was a great thing to be on a board and now it made you a little nervous, there's boardsource.com that will also provide you with some information. And finally, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, which provides just decent, solid information on what's happening in the public sector around fundraising, donors, and IRS investigations. So, on that note, I will open it up for questions. And if you could tell me your name and please stand up.
Hi, I'm Elaine Whitty from the New York chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association.
Well,
thank you. Actually, what drew me to this seminar was the following question. Since we are a chapter, part of a larger organization,
okay,
and being presented with an affiliation agreement,
yes,
which we don't really like because it's really sort of non-negotiable from the standpoint of the national organization, I was just wondering if you could address, sort of what latitude does anybody have if they want to be a chapter of an existing national organization and confronted with, this type of a situation?
Well, certainly some of the tensions I was mentioning earlier are affecting you. In the past, chapters had a lot more flexibility than they do now. Headquarters is more concerned that they can state with some degree of authority what's happening in each local chapter. And if you don't sign that agreement, they don't have that assurance. Something you might want to consider is starting your own similar group that would work on the issues that you feel are not being covered by the full by the local chapter, or is being constrained by these new rules. But you've got to sign the form.
Exactly how it is.
Exactly how it is. The only other option is to have all of the chapters ask for a meeting with headquarters and try and negotiate around the edges. But absent that, you're pretty much stuck.
So is it the obligation of a corporate headquarters then to have an affiliation agreement that
Yes.
has every chapter exactly the same?
Yes.
So is it really likely that, like, New York and California, which hasn't signed on yet because of this issue of autonomy, could really, we have the largest memberships in both of these states anyway. Can the national headquarters in its legal capacity really negotiate with us?
Well,
New York and California?
Well, I think the pressures in California and New York are different than in other states. Or maybe Texas, you could probably add that as well.
Right.
So that would give you a justification for at least trying to negotiate additional autonomy. But absent bringing all the chapters together and demanding a little more flexibility, it's going to be very difficult from just a strict legal background.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Cheryl Pemberton. I have two questions as it relates to the 501c3 C7 relationship. The federal legislation that you referred to before, is that the scrutiny is the same for both the C7s and the C3s?
It's much less for the C7.
Less for the C7.
Much less for the C7.
Okay. But it's there nonetheless regarding the budget and...
Right, just making sure that you have a clear accounting of your money.
Okay.
Okay?
Another question. I see a lot, and then one of the organizations that I'm working with is creating a 501c3 that's kind of but sort of, and not really connected to a C7.
Okay.
So, I mean, I'm hearing a lot that when you create a 501c3, you have to be really careful about it.
Yes, you
appearing
do.
to be connected to another nonprofit.
Yes, you do, but usually that's not a problem with C7s. It's normally C3s and C4s. That's the area that raises that particular red flag. Under the theory that you're supposed to be engaged in you are not allowed to be engaged in partisan political activity as a C3, but you are as a C4, and if you're operating on the same floor of the same building, what's going on? That's what raises the red flag.
Okay.
You see? But with a C3 and a C7, the C7 is usually not going to be engaged in political activity.
Right.
So that's why the red flag's not there.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yes.
Hi, my name is Sarah Davey.
Hi, Sarah.
I'm with the Medical Relief Alliance.
Mm-hmm.
And we provide grants to some partner organizations in Africa to conduct our program activities.
Right.
And I just want to ensure that, that we're working in cooperation to conduct these programs, but it is, we have to...
You have to trust them.
Right.
Right? Well, again, in that case, it's a question of what type of accountability factors have you placed in that relationship, okay? Are you sending is the check being written out to an individual? You don't want that. You want it to be written out to an organization. You want to make sure that if there were an audit, that you'd be able to show how the money was spent, even if it's spent overseas, right?
Okay.
So it doesn't mean that, and this is in contrast to the first question we had, in your case, your distance is providing you with challenges that maybe chapters face domestically. It's the same type of situation. If you are audited, you still are responsible for explaining how the money was used. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Susan Augustus. I'm starting a brand new nonprofit, and I'm in the negotiation with the IRS right now, and they came back to me and said that my idea for nonprofit was too close to a profit. Now, I'll give you the example. It's going to be a gym and a spa for underprivileged women in Harlem.
Okay.
And
what's the nonprofit part of that?
the health, there's going to also be classes in nutrition and
Okay.
well, proper nutrition, diet, exercise, relaxation techniques, all to deal with better health for women.
Right.
So, I mean, something about my membership dues, because it's on a sliding scale.
It is
So,
on a sliding
right,
scale based on income.
Right,
Okay.
but I put an arbitrary number of 300 for someone that could afford to pay.
That could. Okay.
And
And how does 300 compare to just walking into any private school?
I went to McBurney yesterday, the other day, and it's almost $1,000 per year.
Okay.
So I'm like, okay. So I'm trying to, I guess I should push more the education.
You have to. You push the educational aspect, but also the disparities in health outcomes for African American women, since that's your target area, right? You're in a localized area. You're trying to improve the health and mental health of the women who live there, right?
Right.
And having a nice place to go that has nice music and someone will do things to you is a very good thing.
And there's definitely correlation.
So what will help you is to have a doctor provide you with a letter saying that this would be very useful to the women I see. Get as much community support as you can to show it's not just a commercial venture masquerading as a nonprofit. Okay? So any of the surrounding groups that might want to work with you or who would send people to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, sir.
Hi, Richard Espinal. I'm with the New York province of the Society of Jesus.
The Society of
Jesus,
Okay.
the Jesuits. And
Oh yeah, I know that.
I'm basically running what is essentially a program under the auspices of the province, but the goal is eventually to spin off into an independent nonprofit.
Okay,
But currently, I'm wholly funded by the province,
that's okay.
and I'm wondering in terms of,
And this is religious activity,
for the most part, yeah.
religious and educational, or just
It's community outreach, so there's, basically,
around, what are the issues?
it is faith formation, but also it could be immigration issues, social services, it could be literacy, basically it's trying to fill the gaps
Okay,
of
okay,
what the community needs.
right, okay. So
Either,
social service based with some faith-based placed in it?
yeah.
Okay,
And my question is really, because I'm wholly funded through the province right now, when I do the filing and all my paperwork to become independent, do I basically have to report, the budget or the money that I've been getting from the province in terms of what my budget for the organization is,
oh, sure. Say, for example, you've been doing this outreach for the last 3 years. You don't have to report on the last 3 years. Before your fiscal year, that's going to be your starting point, you have to show what is the background on that money that's in your bank account. Where did it come from, right? So that's where it will come out who your original donor was. And that's legitimate, that's not a problem. It's not a problem for you.
Second question is, I've worked with nonprofits before, and nonprofits can make money, at least in the sense that
Yes, they can. Yes, they
and,
can. But there's an important but.
But
Go ahead.
that's where or how does the IRS make that that distinction? Because
Okay.
there's millions of dollars being
Here's the difference. If the difference between a nonprofit and a profit corporation. With respect to a profit corporation, the whole point is to make money. In fact, if you don't make money, then there's a problem, right? And once you make money, then you're going to issue shares or dividends, or there's some way for you to then divide up that profit amongst your owners, however those owners are defined. That's the major difference between a for-profit and a non-profit. You're not supposed to have any personal, private benefit from the work you do, okay? So if you generate profit from selling these wristbands or t-shirts or hats or whatever, that's fine as long as those funds are then used to still benefit your target group, okay? So making money isn't the problem. It's how you spend it and how you distribute it that can create problems. As long as it's going right back into the organization and is being used for the benefit of your target audience, you're going to be okay.
What about, Heather, I'm a student, Heather, I'm a student here. What about large nonprofits who keep reserves?
Yes, those reserves.
For when natural disasters happen and their ability to fundraise is hurt, they use those reserves to fund the organization and maintain. But
And to keep going.
right.
Well, I'm glad you raised that issue because the Red Cross is facing that very question right now. And some of you know that stemmed from what happened in New York over 9/11, right? Now, the practice that got them into trouble is one they have been using for over 60 years, which is we just raise money and we don't worry about targeting it for a particular disaster, no matter how horrific. Well, people had a problem with that, and they are having a problem with it concerning Katrina. It's like, well, I want to devote some funds to the Katrina reconstruction, but I'm not so much concerned about everyday business or making your reserves safe. I think it's an issue of integrity, and I think if large nonprofits do not address it, they will lose. I think they will lose public support as a result. I think in the case of the Red Cross, they were very aggressive in reversing what had been their policy, but they still have not made up the ground that they lost since 9/11. Back then, I'll come here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Montaji Rahman. I go to Queens College.
Where?
Queens College.
Okay.
And my question is, what's the difference between NGOs and nonprofit if there are any?
Well, non-governmental organizations are recognized by the UN as groups that are capable of doing social work in countries outside of their home. They may or may not be a nonprofit. They just are not a governmental organization. So that's where the NGO comes from. But 95% of the time they are nonprofits or charities or public charities. Okay? Does that help?
Yes.
Yes. Well, once again, the IRS is going to look at your normal budget and ask, are the expenses that are being utilized for that current disaster reasonable? I think we're going to see a lot of audits after Katrina's over. That's my own personal view. And one of the reasons for that is because of the initial bumbling by our government, now everyone's trying to get it right, and they're throwing money, and nobody knows where this money's going. Okay? And if that's the case, that needs audits at some point. But again, it's a test of reasonableness. If you have the worst natural disaster in history, then that means your expenses are going to be higher, right? You're going to be running your shelters longer. You're going to have trailer parks. You're going to do, whatever it takes to keep people sheltered while these homes are being rebuilt, right? So, certainly, my guess is that the reserves will be lower and the expenses will be much higher. Yes?
Hi, I'm Joe Marcus. I'm president of Field of Information Science and Technology. We've been around for a year and a half now, and we were operating as a nonprofit from New York State. We just recently filled out our federal. No, actually, we still haven't raised that kind of money yet, so
okay.
We're still under the $25,000 in the
Okay.
So what I wanted to ask was, we're now going into that phase where we're starting to grow. We've got people calling us from New York, from New Jersey, we're actually a New York-based organization, but we have chapters now in DC,
right,
in Texas.
Okay.
So my concern is, how do I get them registered? Do I register them as a under my umbrella,
right,
or do I have them incorporated as a 501c6, which that's what we really are?
right.
The nonprofit part of the organization is done on the national scope, where all the presidents sit and we take care of the divide issues, we take care of all this. So we are a 501c3 here,
right,
at headquarters.
Right.
But the local chapters,
C6s.
we would look at them as 501c6s for multiple purposes, so that they could do their networking events, and they could do, because you can't do networking in a 501c3.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So my question is, okay, is that the best way to go about it?
I think for now, until you get a little larger. When you get a little larger, then you're going to probably have to flip into formal chapters, and you'll be 501c3 across the board. That'd be my guess.
All right, second question.
Okay?
When you fill for this nonprofit 501c3, you've been waiting since
Oh, yes.
April.
Oh, that's not long.
That's not long. No, because I'm like wondering if they're,
No. That's not bad. That's
So-
not bad. Now, if you told me it was, November 2 years ago, then I'd say we've got a problem. But last April? Oh, no.
So they usually take how long?
If you receive your preliminary letter, because they do 3 levels. They do 3 levels of review. The first letter basically says, we've received your information and you look okay, but we're not sure. We'll be back to you within 2 years. Okay, that's what the first letter says. And then your most important letter is that one that comes in 2 years. That says whether or not we're going to recognize you as a public charity or as a private foundation. Okay? And you want the public charity for a number of different reasons. So typically it can take anywhere from 6 months to 13 months to get that first letter, depending on which region. And you're in New York, which means your papers are processed in Maryland. You're doing okay so far. If you haven't heard by Christmas, I would call.
Now that brings me to my next question.
Okay, one more.
Okay, I'm using now as a 501c3. We are a 501c3 or a nonprofit because only the Spencer says we are.
Yes,
Okay?
and that's very important. Keep him happy.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the reason why. But the biggest problem is as a 501c3, I've had to use a fiscal agent.
Yes,
Am I doing the right thing by having a fiscal?
Yes.
Because most of the people that we're going after for money, the Microsofts of the world,
Right.
to help in our communities,
Right.
it's never done.
right. Fiscal agent is fine, that's not a problem. That's just a person who serves as your legal representative to accept paperwork or any formal notices. That's not a problem, I wouldn't worry about that. Okay? Oh, how about over here? Oh, okay.
Hi, I'm Erica. I'm husband. I'm in the process of starting a women's center in Brooklyn, and I have several questions, but I think they're short. So first of all, we want to have the word progressive in our mission.
Okay.
Is that
That's fine.
partisan?
Be as progressive as you want to be.
I don't want to.
No, you're fine.
Okay, that's good to know. We also have a fiscal sponsor or a fiscal conduit, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about disconnecting from them when
Yes.
we have our nonprofit status.
Okay.
We also, long-term, want to become a fiscal sponsorship organization for emerging
For other
departments.
groups,
So
okay?
I wanted to know if 501c3 is the appropriate,
Okay.
thing to get. And also, I wanted to know, I've been reading a lot about membership. Are we a membership organization? Are we not a membership organization? And the last one is, we want to be a sort of alternative cooperative organization, and I feel like if we file that within our bylaws, the IRS is going to be like, what the hell is going on here?
If you do what? I didn't hear the last part.
If we're an alternative, if we have alternative structures in our bylaws, so,
Don't do it.
okay, so,
Don't do it. That's just a red flag.
okay. So
Okay.
now, should we change our bylaws after we file them with people, or is that,
Well, I mean, you can always amend your bylaws. There's never a problem with that.
you
Okay?
can refile them once you do that?
Yes, you do.
Okay.
Yes, you do. Hold, because you had about 20 different questions there. I'm going to see if I can process them while I take this one.
Thank you.
You bet.
Hi, my name is Zenzali. I'm a New York City math teacher, and I'm interested in starting a nonprofit because I just had a child and I don't want to go back.
Okay.
Anyway, I wanted to form an after-school program, and without getting into the details, I just want to know when you start an after-school program with children, do you have to get special insurance?
Yes.
Okay, and where would you go to get that information?
Well, you can go to a standard broker, but typically there are insurance companies that specialize on schools. Those are the ones you're going to want to talk to, okay? And it's typical things, making sure that you have child-proof the space. If a child breaks a limb, that there's a hospital or a medical facility nearby, those types of things. That's what they'll look for, and that will influence the rate that you're able to get. Okay, but you definitely need to do that. You also have to get permits. Okay?
Thank you.
All right, I'm still coming back to you. Yes?
My name is Sheila Dayton.
I'm sorry?
Sheila Dayton.
Okay?
We're looking to start a nonprofit to help underprivileged students go to college.
Go to college, okay.
We received an application from a law firm, and one thing that they asked for was a reasonable financial plan. What is considered reasonable?
Okay. That's an excellent question. Reasonable financial plan. That's lawyer speak for, let's make sure that if we spend time helping you set this up, that you actually are going to have something to show for that. All it really means is that you have a way of raising money. How are you going to generate the funds that will help you get these kids into college, right? Are you planning fundraisers? Are you having social events, basketball tournaments? I mean, what are you going to do to raise your initial pool of money? Okay? Secondly, once you're able to raise it, who's actually going to help you manage that money? Have you talked to some banks? Have they offered a great rate on a CD or some other financial instrument that will help you generate additional funds, especially since it's in the educational arena that you are working. And I know that you're aware of all the college-bound plans that they have at banks these days, and maybe they can suggest a special instrument that you use. Beyond that, how are you set up long-term? You're talking about college, then that means you're encouraging children over a period of time. You can't say, oh, we're going to send you to college in a year. I mean, that's not going to work. You're talking about a long-term relationship with a number of schools. Who are the schools that are going to feed you students that you're going to target, right? Because you can't, obviously, unless you have a lot more money than I'm aware of, help every child in New York City. So are you focused on Queens or Brooklyn or Manhattan? And if so, what's your plan for encouraging support from other businesses within your target area, right? So when they say a reasonable plan, that's what they're looking for. How are you going to generate the type of funds that you need? Okay? How much more time do we have, Jack?
How many more questions are there out there?
Oh boy.
Three more?
I'll take 4 more, and then I still have this pending one here. Okay? I'll probably end on that. See, I've seen her before. That's where I can go. Yes.
Your written materials gave a brief description of 501c3, 4, and 7. The gentleman's question touched briefly on 501c6. Could you give us a sentence about 501c5 and 501c6 and where labor organizations such as unions and trade associations might fit in this mechanism?
Okay. Well, I will not only do that, but I'll show you where you can find it as well. Okay. Okay. If you taking you to the IRS site, and we have information divided by individuals, businesses, charities, and nonprofits, governments, tax professionals, etc. We would go here, and then we can look at here. In most cases, when the IRS is given a ruling on something, they will have it on this page. So, for example, they've just recently revised Form 1023. This is the new form that you would use. That's just an example. Okay? Okay. All right, that's one place. Let me show you another place. So I told you the checklist was from findlaw.com. I'll show you how you find the particular code section as you want. Okay, in this instance, you're looking for IRC, which stands for Internal Revenue Code, section 501, and we'll look for 501C to bring up the whole list. Cases I wanted to code. Let's go back. Okay. So we're looking at U.S. federal laws. Okay. That's the section where we are now. Okay. Okay, while I'm looking for this, I have 3 more questions. No, I've come to you already. You, ma'am.
Marilyn Feingold.
Hello.
I thought I wanted to start a nonprofit. I'm wondering if another strategy, and that's what I asked, might be to identify the nonprofits that are within the avenue of my interest
Okay, what's your interest?
Health education through menu art.
Through what kind of art?
Menu art.
Okay.
I have collected the menus of the last 40 years and actually have an exhibition, but I've come for other reasons to see the connection as to how menu art could be a venue for education. And I thought I would start a nonprofit. I'm wondering
Okay.
if it might not be wiser to look to see what existing foundations exist either through Peru or through the Wellness Center. And I have a presentation, I mean, I have substantive material, vis-a-vis what I've worked on, to bring it to a nonprofit that exists and to see if they would take it on as an activity or as a project.
Okay, what other groups have you found doing something similar?
William Grimes has said that I am unique.
Okay, all right.
I don't mean to,
No, that's fine.
It's truly a very idiosyncratic, amazing effort that I have.
Okay, and do you have some initial supporters, people who are willing to put up some funds to help you launch this?
No, in Manhattan, what happened in Rhode Island was Johnson & Wales was the sponsor for this project.
Okay.
And they were, I did this total volunteer. And then it became a sponsor, they paid for the production of the material.
Okay.
When I came to New York, the idea was to continue it through New York State Restaurant Association.
I don't know who that is.
And quite candidly, the networking was at a different level than I'm comfortable with. So I needed to strategize, develop a presentation folder. One waits for phone calls back unless you're at a certain level of networking. So my New York experience is different from my Rhode Island experience.
Okay.
And since I really believe in what I heard, and I came here thinking that maybe the nonprofit, but I'm wondering if there might be other groups.
Okay. Well, I don't have an immediate answer to your question, but I do know that we're going to be doing much more work in the arts moving forward as part of our nonprofit outreach.
And will it be announced in the future by the dean? Stay
Right.
tuned.
Stay tuned. I'm coming back. I've got time for one more question, and then as we close out, I'll still get back to the major questions that are still pending. No, I already got to you. Yes.
Well, Dave, we've been putting together a called Voter 18 that does voter education and political training, voter registration.
Yes.
With a focus on people of color.
Yes.
And the question I have is, the recruitment is purely nonpartisan.
Yes.
But we want to make sure that there's no issues in terms of that still can come under a 501c3, be deductible without.
Yes.
And the second half of the question is, if it takes time to get your status, and people or individuals give in the meantime, what is the status of their contribution?
As long as the application has been filed and is pending, they can make contributions. Those will be treated as if you were already a 501c3. And that's why that letter issue I mentioned to the gentleman over here is a big deal, because if the letter says you're not, then any contributions received after that date will not be treated that way. It's not retroactive. No, it is not retroactive. With respect to voter education, registration programs, as long as they are nonpartisan and whoever comes up, you register, you will not have a problem. There's also a second section called 4945F that you could apply under for extra protection for any large donors. And that is, if you're going to operate in 5 or more states, you really want to look into that particular section. But there's nothing on the face of it that would prevent you from organizing as a 501c3. Okay? Great. Okay,
If you had additional questions, can you email you, or would you have email address perhaps?
oh, that's a good question. How are we gonna follow up to this, Jack? We didn't talk about that in advance. Because we had a nonprofit day, that's where I met a few
We
of
have a
you.
follow-up mechanism in the spring. We don't have an immediate one, but we have a consulting day, which this is one of the opportunities that people have to sign up to get 45 minutes of time for particular issues that they have. So that's probably the best way to get some advice from us. Otherwise, I would suggest in the short run to follow some of the leads that Sonia has given you and other sources of information.
To answer the earlier question, labor and agricultural organizations can organize under 501c5. Business leagues can organize under C6, which you had mentioned. C7s are social and recreational. C8s, I believe, are fraternal benefit organizations. Credit unions can organize under 501c14. Farmers can organize under 501c16. And there are a couple others I can't remember right off my head. But if you go to Westlaw or to LexisNexis, which I hope we have time to do today, that's another place where you can actually read the text of the code. Or go to the IRS site. Okay, that's another easy place. Membership, those are always a little tricky, only because you have to have real members. They want to just make sure you're not just making up names and using it as a front to funnel cash through. So as long as you have some real bodies, always take pictures at your annual meetings. You think I'm kidding? I'm very, very serious about this. Anytime you have a meeting, take a picture. Okay? You're showing that you're reaching out. Keep track of any media you receive. That's another way of getting your message out and showing that you're reaching out to the community. Let's see. Progressive was fine. Don't do it. Always make it clear, and I think we had another question where you're separating from the mothership, if you will. You just want to make sure that you're describing carefully the source of the funds that you're using to start off. If you do that, you're going to be okay. As a general. Okay? Thank you all very much.